shot me up with something to put me to sleep. And when I woke up, there's this male nurse or something with a clipboard, and he asked me, "What day is it?" And I asked him, "How long have I been asleep?" So he puts down, not oriented to time. And that was kind of how things went. I was told, that I was mentally ill, I would never get better, I'd have to take these drugs for the rest of my life. And those that believed I was a lawyer said I would never do that again. And when I told them I graduated from Harvard Law School, that confirmed I was delusional.
Hi, so it's my pleasure to be joined by Jim Gottstein here today. And I've known of Jim for a long time, and many of you may have known of him as well. He was the lawyer who actually made available a lot of the Zyprexa papers, which led to one of the biggest settlements in I guess the history of lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies. I think it was $3 billion or something like that. So he had a really integral role with that. Other really interesting things about Jim is he's done a lot of work helping with involuntary commitment and people getting committed on poor legal grounds. He was very busy doing that kind of work. And he also has his own personal story about mania as well, which led to a lot of his interest in being active in this area. Jim's also done a lot of work with other, I guess I would say, leaders in psychiatric reform on how to improve mental health outcomes. And we're going to be talking about all of those things today. So Jim, thanks so much for making the time. It's great to have you on.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here, Joseph. Thanks for having me.
Jim, I think a really nice place to start, just so the audience has a sense of where you're coming from, is tell us how you got into all of this. Your experiences with the psychiatric system, I guess, growing up.
So I was, just living my life. I'd graduated from law school, was practicing law, and I got into a situation where I took on too much and didn't sleep. And I've subsequently learned that anybody will, go psychotic. I like the term go, crazy, but go psychotic if they sleep deprived enough. And I'm not particularly tolerant of it. Anyway, so I had gone over to my dad's house to try and get some sleep, and I had just fallen asleep for a second, and I woke up and heard the devil coming down the hall. And I was on the second floor, and I looked out the window, and there was a lawn down there and a sidewalk, and I knew how to do a parachute landing fall. So I figured if I missed the sidewalk, I'd be fine. I jumped out of the window and did a perfectly good parachute landing fall on the missed the sidewalk, ran across the street into this parking
What
lot.
is a parachute landing fall? How do you do that type of fall?
Well, I was a skydiver, and so that's it's just where you hit your feet and you kind of roll. You've seen it happen.
Okay.
Although these days they've got, this was back when we used surplus, World War II chutes. It was in the mid-70s. But anyway, so it's just where you hit and then you kind of roll it to take the shock so that you don't injure yourself. Okay. And so I was looking over my shoulder for the devil, and so I was like spinning around. Anyway, they came in the paddy wagon and put me in a straitjacket and hauled me off to the hospital and shot me up with something to put me to sleep. And when I woke up, there's this male nurse or something with a clipboard, and he asked me, "What day is it?" And I asked him, "How long have I been asleep?" So he puts down, not oriented to time. and that was kind of how things went. And I was told that, I would, that I was mentally ill, I would never get better, I would have to take these drugs for the rest of my life. And those that believed I was a lawyer said I would never do that again. And when I told them I graduated from Harvard Law School, that confirmed I was delusional.
Oh my God.
And, of course it's, ascertainable. Anyway, so, but, and I've run into that before where people will say something that seems a little bit, maybe a little bit grandiose, and they could check it out, but they don't. Anyway, so that really caused me to, was a big redirection of my life. And so I became an advocate of people diagnosed with serious mentally ill and caught up in the system.
Let me ask you this. Did you believe any of that, at least at the start, when you went in there and I guess the psychosis abated? Was it a journey for you to realize that, hey, actually, I don't want to take these meds for the rest of my life, and there's probably another way that is going to work for me? Like, what was that like?
Well, first off, it was very depressing to get that message. And so, you could say, well, there's, it's manic, and so that was the high part, and then depression, the low part of, manic depression or bipolar disorder. But actually that message itself was really depressing. But I was extremely lucky, which is how I characterize my life generally. And I after a couple of psychiatrists, I got this one, Robert Alberts, who actually had been a Japanese prisoner of war in World War II in Indonesia. He was just a fabulous guy. And he said, look, you got yourself in a situation where you didn't sleep. Anybody will, become psychotic if they don't sleep, and you just need to learn how to deal with it. And so I have various, I do various things to kind of keep myself from getting there. And one is that I'm a lawyer, and you have briefs that need to file and deadlines. And I always try, and what happens is I've got the deadline and I'm thinking about it, and I can't go to sleep. And so the way that I deal with that is I try and file it the day before it's due to keep from getting, and that's pretty unusual for a lawyer because you can always make things better by doing another draft. But I get it to where I think it's good enough, and I like to think my good enough is pretty good, and get it filed. But then so there's a progression that, I recognize that I have a progression. And the first one is I'll be sharp and witty, which I'm not right now. But anyway, so, and I know no one else notices that. And then I'll get to a point where I'll have thought blocking, which is, where you kind of stop talking, in the middle. It's not quite having trouble finding words. And so that's, kind of a sign. And then I'll get to the point where I think people are looking at me funny, and that's not good. And so what I do about that is first off, I tell myself, people are probably not looking at me funny. And then I'll go, but if they are, it's probably because I'm doing something weird. And then I try, and then I think of myself as like looking down at myself to try and observe myself to, make sure I'm not doing anything, too weird. And if at that point, I would take a benzo. I liked Halcyon, which is, much maligned because, in the UK especially, people would
murder. All of those like sleepwalking murders and things like that, right?
Yeah. But I was on a pretty low dose, but it was the most delicious sleep. And but another place I was lucky is that I was a pilot, which, by the way, the hospital could care less about. I mean, I could tell you the whole thing about them wanting to put me on lithium. And, but I lost my medical certificate, and then Dr. Albert's really helped me get it back. But they said I couldn't fly for 2 days after taking it. So that was before I knew how addictive the benzos were, and I really liked flying, and so that really, I think, helped me from taking it very much. And I'd go a year without taking it. Yeah, I haven't taken it since I moved to Hawaii 4 years ago.
So let me ask you this, because clearly not everyone, when they become sleep deprived, goes into mania or psychosis, right? And this seems like it was something that you learnt about yourself. Like after you learnt that about yourself, and I guess you learnt how to manage it with, sedatives at various points, I guess recognizing when things were starting to slip. Do you consider yourself to have bipolar disorder? Like, how do you make sense of the fact that happens to you? What do you think of it? Do you give it a label? Like, how do you understand it?
Well, I don't find the diagnosis that helpful, really. So I do I qualify for that diagnosis? Back when it happened to me, I was told, about maybe a third of the people just have it once, get it mania once, and another third get it twice, and then another third get it periodically. So maybe I actually qualify for that diagnosis. But it's like, to what end is that diagnosis useful for? I mean, to me, I know I need to keep from getting in that state. And one of the things that I've kind of noticed, let me back up a bit. So before it happened to me, I had no idea anything like that could happen, right? That my mind would become unreliable. My thinking would just become screwed up like that. And so that was a complete shock. But once it happened to me, it was like, okay, well, I'll take these steps. I learned how to take these steps. But I found a lot of people really have a problem recognizing when they're getting into that state, and so and take steps. And I don't know about that. There's this WRAP program, the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, which is designed, to help people, for people to figure out what helps, what their triggers are, and having a kind of an emergency plan that I think is very useful.
I'm going to segue now. Thanks for filling us in on that, and actually talk about your work with David Cohen and Peter Goethe, and on improving mental health outcomes. You recently published a piece on that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Where did the idea to do something like this come from, and what you identified as the main areas that we should be focusing on to improve?
So there was, in 2022, there was legislation passed in Alaska, and I'll just make a long story short. And one of the things that came out of it was that the legislature required a report on a number of things, like patient trauma, the grievance process, which Faith Myers, one of the other authors, had been lobbying for years. They were in a rush to enact enabling legislation for what's called this crisis now approach for psychiatric emergencies. And so Faith had been lobbying for this stuff for years, a decade. And they said, oh, we don't have time for this, but we'll do a report. And I suggested that they add that the report make recommendations regarding improving patient outcomes. And just those 3 words. And so then the same authors and a couple more other people did some input into that report, but it had a lot of Alaska stuff in it, and like specific recommendations for changing, for amending statutes and those sorts of things, and but also some more universally applicable information. And so I thought, let's do one that people around the country and really around the world can use for advocacy. And I think the thing about it is, for people in my world, who are critical of psychiatry, I don't think really any single part of it is news, but it's put together in a way specifically to be presented to policymakers and potential funders to take another approach. So it starts out basically with noting that our current system has basically a 5% recovery rate for people who are put on the neuroleptics, and we see through open dialogue and soteria that we could really have an 80% recovery rate if we tried to avoid putting people on the neuroleptics in the first place. And that people who are on neuroleptics for a while and get off, they have a 40% chance of recovery, which is 8 times better than 5, but half of 80. So that's kind of the setting. Plus, that people in the public mental health system diagnosed with serious mental illness have a 20 year or so shorter lifespan. That's clearly attributable to the psych drugs. So that's one of the settings. And then so that raises the question of why are we doing this? And so then we have
why is that happening from your perspective, high level? Yeah.
So there's two reasons. One is that society wants troublesome people out of the way, and they have designated psychiatry as a mechanism to get those people out of the way. And of course, they basically say it's in people's best interest. But the other reason is that the clinical drug literature, the clinical trial drug literature, is basically fraudulent, and so we have a section on that. And my book, the Zyprexa papers, goes into one drug and some of the fraudulent mechanism that they used to say that Zyprexa was safe and effective. So that's one. Then and the other, and basically that involuntary psychiatric interventions.
I'm gonna jump in here before we move on, because I think it's a really interesting point. Because I was always trained that to prevent recurrences of psychosis, keeping people on maintenance antipsychotic therapy really was the gold standard, and that's the expectation. And that if you're not doing that, you're harming them, because you're not preventing further episodes of psychosis coming through. So what's that all about? Because everyone, I think it's clear to most people, short-term use of antipsychotic medications, they can blunt psychosis, they can calm people down, they can put them to sleep. I think that's pretty clear in emergency situations that there could be some use for that, especially if you can't really isolate or quarantine these people when that's going on. But the maintenance side of it, the ongoing treatment, that's such a fixed idea in mainstream psychiatry. So why do people think that is the way to go about helping people who have psychotic illness?
Well, I mean, that's basically the story that's sold. There's a huge amount of research that shows that's not true. And I think Favas, wrote about it in the mid-90s or something. But anyway, so what happens is that the neuroleptics block 70 to 90% of the dopamine transmission in the brain, in the frontal lobe, the basal ganglia, and the limbic system. And I used to think of them as a chemical straitjacket, but actually they're literally a chemical lobotomy. But what the brain does in response to that blockage is for a few weeks, it pumps out more dopamine to compensate. And then it gives up and grows more dopamine receptors. And so while they've never shown any kind of brain abnormality in people diagnosed, say, with schizophrenia before the drugs were introduced, there are all kinds of brain abnormalities afterwards. There's increased dopamine receptors is one, brain shrinkage is another. So then you've got all these extra dopamine receptors, to compensate for the blockage. And then if someone goes off the drugs, then, all of a sudden they do have kind of a surge of dopamine, and that causes a relapse. And so that's when basically psychiatrists say, see, you really need these drugs. So,
well, with that being said, so, I mean, that makes sense to me, that potentially that, you're mistaking, I guess, a withdrawal, withdrawal-related psychosis for psychosis coming from the condition. But I was wondering, are you familiar that with the first paper from the RADAR study that came out recently from Joanna Moncrieff, and how they it did look like even doing a gradual slow reduction, at least at the 2-year mark, off, showed no difference in relapse. I was wondering if you could kind of comment on that.
I thought that they were looking at social functioning. I don't think that, but maybe relapse was in there too. And that was interesting because that's a little bit different than the Harrow and Job results. But what they found was that it was really later years that you saw the dramatic improvement. So I understand they're going to do follow-ups at 4 and like 7.5 years or something like that. So I'll be interested to see what happens with that.
Yeah, same here. Because that would be really something if they replicated those results. And so, do you believe this translates also to bipolar as well? We're talking about schizophrenia, but also because that maintenance treatment on mood stabilizing medications may also be detrimental for the bipolar illnesses long term.
Yeah, I think almost certainly. I mean, I said before that when I had my episode, it was like a third would have 1 episode, another third would have 2, and then another third would have periodic. But now with the being put on the drugs, you're seeing people just going up and down, up and down, up and down, fairly rapid cycling, and you never saw that before. As I understand. I mean, Peter Breggin, I think it was Dr. Breggin, told me once that he had never really seen anybody that could be diagnosed with bipolar disorders for many years, and then all of a sudden there are all these people. I think part of it is kind of diagnostic fashion. It's not altogether the diagnostic categories are, maybe not all that clear and concrete.
I think talking about Peter Breggin is interesting because, he's been at this for a long time. I think he's probably in his 80s now. And so, he was a practicing psychiatrist before psychiatry became big business. And I think that's probably hard for a lot of people to maybe even conceptualize a time when, you weren't seeing antidepressant ads on TV and antipsychotic ads on TV. And it was, this multi-billion-dollar industry. But before that, it was kind of small potatoes and not really worth the investment. And it's just, it was in a time where I think there wasn't any of the disease mongering that's happening now, where you have constant promotion of psychiatric conditions, which really leads to people, I guess, identifying with a lot of them as well. So that's one problem with it. And doctors think they see it more often. And then along with that is, we've kind of had bipolar disorder turn from something that I think used to be very classical, these periods of grandiose mania that may go on for a couple of weeks, which would then burn out and crash into a depression. And that's how it was described for a very long time. But nowadays, everything can be bipolar disorder, at least the way I've seen it in clinical practice. If you're just irritable for long periods of time, or you're depressed for long periods of time, that's what counts as bipolar disorder these days. It's completely shifted. And yeah, so I always think that's interesting. And I also, another thing that's interesting is most trainees these days, entering psychiatry, I would say probably from the early 90s onwards, would be very confused, because now you're going to be looking at a lot of different things that could be bipolar disorder, when in the past it was this very fixed kind of idea. And I think that's completely changed. And most people may never see a case of bipolar disorder that hasn't been exposed to several rounds of medications, which just really kind of can be confusing for getting the diagnosis right for that.
Well, I think there's, I can't remember exactly offhand, but I think this is about right, which is, a pretty high percentage of people put on the SSRIs, antidepressants, become manic. Like in the 20% range. And the same with, children you put on the stimulants for, so-called ADHD. And so, that's a pathway. And so then instead of saying, oh, let's look at what these drugs are doing and try and let's see what happens without them, they say, oh, you've got bipolar disorder, and then start prescribing the heavy duty drugs. And I want to go back to one thing you said, which is about using the neuroleptics, short term to get, to help get someone to sleep. And I think, probably a benzo for short term is better for that than a neuroleptic. And I know Seroquel is just used for insomnia a lot. And I think
crazy.
It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it can cause tardive dyskinesia. It's insane. Hey, just want to interrupt quickly and just say, if you're enjoying the content that we're producing here, that you consider liking, subscribing, and commenting on the videos. These are the type of things that gets this video kind of pushed to broader audiences, and it can really help us. You've covered, okay, so it sounds like, that one of the main things you talk about is the harmfulness of long-term maintenance therapy with neuroleptics. And I think I cut you off when you were about to talk about involuntary treatment, so I'll let you pick up there.
Right. So, that's kind of the other main, that's another main thing, is that, basically, if it's not voluntary, it's not treatment. And the idea that someone doesn't know how the drugs make them feel, and when they tell them that it's harming them, that's proof that they're mentally ill. It's just outrageous. And so, and also that I call it psychiatric incarceration for involuntary commitment, is massively associated with suicide. So the idea that locking someone up to prevent them from, killing themselves is, literally insane. So that's, so the basic theme is nothing should be involuntary. And then we point out that actually that's what international law provides, that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities actually prohibits any involuntary psychiatric interventions. And I thought it was a miracle that they got that passed. I didn't think they would achieve that. But that's what the CRPD says. And, governments kind of didn't really believe that's what it said. And so there have been a couple of clarifications that, that's what it says. But there are no countries that actually follow it, although maybe Mexico is implementing something. So, and the U.S. has, Obama signed it, but it hasn't been ratified by the Senate.
Well, let me pressure test this just to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. Are you saying that we shouldn't ever be involuntarily committing people to psychiatric hospitals, even if they are even if they are in dangerous states, whether it's mania or acutely suicidal?
Yes. So one of the things about, we talk about a program called Soteria House. Mm-hmm. And the reason I bring this up now is their mantra is to be with people rather than to do to them. So if you're with someone, they can't commit suicide. And Lauren Mosier, who is, he's, a hero to psych survivors, who maybe, a lot of people don't know him now, but, and he was the chief of schizophrenia research at the National Institute of Mental Health and did this Soteria House study, which basically showed that about 80% of people could get through if you really tried to avoid the neuroleptics. He testified in one of my cases that he had never had to commit anybody because he always made it a point to establish a relationship where they could agree on a course of action. He said he would do whatever it took, if someone was about to do grievous harm, but he'd never had to do it because he'd been able to avoid it. And that's, I think, demonstrates kind of the fundamental problem, which is people aren't given, no time is spent on people to really work with them and find out what they want. It's like, I think of being psychiatrically hospitalized as kind of Alice in Wonderland, the Disney movie.
Sure.
It's just really like that. So if you, if they lie to you and say, we're going to let you out on Tuesday, and Tuesday comes and goes and they don't let you out, and then you get angry about that, well, then you're labile, right? And and that everything is a symptom. And so then if you decide that, well, I'm just not going to react, okay, well, then you have a flat affect. And, and if you kind of chuckle to yourself because of the absurdity of the whole situation, then you're responding to internal stimuli. And so everything that you do in the hospital is charted as a symptom.
I think you touched on something interesting, and that can be that we don't invest in spending time with people who are in acute crises. We come and we pick them up in the paddy wagon, just like what happened with you. They get processed in a busy emergency room, and essentially they just get sent to the hospital. And I guess given the practicality of the situation, because I think about involuntary commitments, I guess that I would have been a part of. And I think things like, if someone has a suicide attempt or something like that, I definitely remember doing involuntary commitments in those situations. And it's not because maybe you want them to get placed on medications or anything like that, but it could be more along the lines of you put them somewhere safe while you call their family and you figure out why this happened, and and you put together a safe disposition. Maybe a lot of that could have been done without the hold. But if the people are still suicidal when you talk to them, is that not maybe the more compassionate thing to give someone a couple days to cool off while you put together a plan with their family?
Except that the evidence doesn't bear that out, that locking people up is so traumatic that, I think there's a study that showed in the first week after discharge, men were like 138 times more likely to commit suicide than the general public, and women 240 something times. And so, but that really brings up one of these programs that we really recommend, which are peer respites. Okay. And so that's basically a home-like setting. It's staffed by peers, people with lived experience of having gone through this stuff, so people can go there and be in a safe place. They're not forced to do anything, and just chill out. And there are people they can talk to. They're usually, you can stay 7 to 10 days. There's a video that I pulled from the Peer Respite Soteria Summit a couple years ago called How a FIA House Helped Me, and it's about 5 minutes long. And this person describes how it really helped. I think she's just fabulous. I don't know if you know her. Maddie Hadge. Anyway, I should know her name. Okay. But anyway, she's fabulous.
Yeah. What do you think about? I think. What do you think about like manic episodes? When I think about someone who's in a full blown mania, how much damage you can do when you have disinhibition and you've lost touch with reality. I mean, you might be out there on social media just ruining your reputation or blowing your money or, saying things to your work colleagues that you shouldn't have been saying. I mean, do you see a place for involuntary commitment there, at least for damage control, so they don't completely mess their life up while they're in that acute phase of the mania where they don't have insight?
Well, I think, basically because involuntary commitment is, so harmful, I'd say no, that you got to do something else. And, I know, it's, people go, really do cause damage, to their lives that way. But but locking people up, really causes more damage. So. And
do you say that because because you've lost so much faith in the way the system currently works, and you've heard so many horror stories about what's happened in that situation? It seems like the alternative would be, I guess, less harmful.
Yes, and I'm not really saying do nothing. Mm-hmm. None of this is about doing nothing. So again, I think it's a matter of taking the time to to work with someone and tell them your concerns, and then ask them is there something they want? Gee, have you slept?
Yep.
There was some expert I was at this conference, and he said 100% of the time psychosis is accompanied by sleep deprivation. Well, I don't know about 100%, but I know it's a really high percentage. And so just working on that, that's what, when I would take a benzo, I would take it just for one night and just break that cycle. So, there are other things to do than involuntarily commit someone, just because it ends up. The current system, it's not. If you had a system, you say, well, we're just going to lock you up for a few days and let you chill out and then let you out, but that's not even what happens. What happens is the system insists that people be put on these drugs and stay on them.
In fact, in some places, you can't even justify to their insurance companies keeping them there unless they're on medications. It's essentially like a must, which is kind of scary if you think about it not even being an option, really, for someone to just go there in an unmedicated setting and just let the mania burn out.
Right. Another benefit of the peer respites. Right.
Yeah. Okay. What other prongs are there, I guess, in the report? So you talk about maintenance therapy and antipsychotics and I guess these other things. Was there anything else in there, a major feature?
Well, then that's kind of half of it is, what's wrong with the system. And then the other half of it is what we should be doing instead.
Perfect. Talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I talked about a couple of them, Soteria House, peer respites. Then there's the open dialogue approach that came out of Finland, where they actually eliminated schizophrenia in their part of Finland because a proper diagnosis of schizophrenia required symptoms for 6 months, and they got people through it without it. Before the 6 months. And they take the approach that the problem isn't in the person, but you might call it the spaces between the people. And what they do is they bring everybody in, that's important in the person's life. They bring them together and talk about things and figure out what to do. And that's a fabulous. They've had pretty fabulous results, and that's another place where they basically got an 80% recovery rate, and they did it by. The idea is to avoid the neuroleptics if possible, and they basically had 79% of people who didn't use neuroleptics, and then they had 80% of people who were working or on unemployment, but basically not symptomatic after 5 years. Now maybe there's not 100% overlap on that, but pretty high. So I think what's really clear is that we should be trying to get the people through what they're going through without putting them on the neuroleptics if we can. There may be, a certain number of people that you can't, and I know people who find them helpful, and I think they should have access to them. Not children, but they should have access to them. I think they should be told the truth about them. But even if they're not told the truth about them, if they want them, that's fine. I don't know if you know of Ellen Sachs, a law professor in USC.
I recognize the name, but
yeah, she wrote this book called "The Center Cannot Hold."
Yes,
and I have a completely different interpretation of her life than she does. But she takes them, and she's she's very accomplished. She's a tenured law professor, which is when she came out, by the way, when she got tenure, and you read her story. And she tried all kinds of other things, and she found the neuroleptics worked, and for her, and fine. I have no problem with that. But the idea of forcing these drugs that have such terrible overall outcomes, have such terrible health effects, forcing them on people on the idea that they're in their best interests and they're crazy because they don't want to take them. That's I think outrageous.
There's different levels to this. I'm sure you're aware of it as well, where it's not just, I guess, involuntary med commitments, where, a group of people come out to your home and they say, all right, now it's time to give you your monthly injectable, and if you don't comply, we're going to drag you to inpatient psych, because that's one form of forced treatment, which I think is probably the most frightening version. But there's also a tremendous amount of peer pressure. Anytime someone falls, anytime someone becomes bothersome who has one of these conditions, they say, are you taking your medications? Oh, this happened because you didn't take your meds. And I feel like the whole family turns on these people. And so everything is looked at through this lens of, you've slipped up because you didn't take your meds, and everything is looked at that way. When you go to one doctor, that's essentially what most of them just focus on. It's like, oh, this has happened because we don't have the dose right, or we don't have the medication right. And I think a lot of these people, they would really struggle to ever even find a doctor who would treat them without medications. And so I feel like, yes, people get forced onto the medication sometimes, by that first way I said, but a lot of times it's just by an immense amount of peer pressure and pressure from doctors and their families.
Yes, and lots of times housing is conditioned on taking your meds or something else. And there's a lot of ways that people are forced to take them. I mean, in divorce court, mothers are told, they have to take the meds or they're going to lose their children. And,
that's crazy.
Stuff like that. I mean, parents are told if they don't put their children on stimulants that they'll be taken away from them, and they are. So
I've seen that. Yeah. It's if you don't put your child on a medication, we're going to interpret that as neglect. You're not following the doctor's orders. Yeah. And so, okay. Open dialogue, it's been a success. Why has it just stayed in one region of Norway? Why hasn't it been adopted by the country if it's so successful?
Well, it actually has been spreading quite a bit. There's a lot. They're doing a lot of trainings around the world. There's some places in the U.S. that are doing it. I think there may be even, it's in the report, but maybe 30 countries. But I may be confusing that. Another one of the programs is the Hearing Voices Network.
What's the difference? Because I am aware of the Hearing Voices Network.
So it's what it sounds. It's a support group. People get together and talk, and their mantra is not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And they basically talk about how they keep the voices from causing so much trouble for you. I mean, it turns out, this came out of the Hearing Voices Network. I think it ended up being biggest in the UK, but it really came out of the Netherlands. And they did a study, and they found a pretty high percentage of people actually hear voices in the 10% range. But it's only when the voices really cause problems for people that they end up, getting psychiatric problems. So people talk about different approaches for dealing with them, like arguing with the voices, making appointments with the voices. And sometimes, excuse me, they, excuse me, sometimes the voices may recede and other times they don't, really go away, but people learn how to cope with them so that they're not creating so much of a problem for them. And people find that valuable, and it's a very inexpensive thing. I mean, basically maybe rent a space for meetings, and these days, of course, I assume they're being done on Zoom, and maybe pay a little bit for a facilitator. So that's another one of the approaches that we talk about.
Okay.
So, go ahead.
What do you think are the biggest barriers to things like open dialogue becoming more accepted in in places like the US. I mean, it sounds like the data behind them shows that they're working a lot better than the drug therapy. So what's happening from your perspective?
Well, I think there's kind of this unholy partnership between psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry. And, back in the 70s, there got to be a lot of alternatives to talk therapy, psychiatrists. You had psychologists, you had social workers, other, family counselors, other therapists that were posing a lot of competition to the psychiatrists. And so then, turning it into a medical issue that requires drugs, that only, especially then, it's been eroded a little bit, but only psychiatrists can prescribe these medications and their drugs. And so they really, push this approach. And there's so much money that's being made by this approach is, I think, the big barrier. And I think the most important thing to change that is to educate the public about, get them to understand what's going on, which is really hard. I mean, I think there used to be more of a separation between news and advertising, but now, the drug industry is by far and away the biggest source of ad revenue. And so it's really pretty hard to break through.
Do you feel, do you see attacks against things like Hearing Voices Network and open dialogue in mainstream medical publications and things like that, saying it's reckless or it's dangerous or things like that? Do they just, does the media, I guess what I want to know is, are those things ignored or are they kind of attacked?
My sense is they're just ignored, that they haven't come through enough to be attacked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is one group where I think this type of thing should be appealing to, right? Because it would be insurance payers. Because something like, psychiatric hospitalizations aren't cheap. Has there ever been any luck having meetings with insurance payers for funding things like open dialogue and things like that?
You would think that would be an obvious thing, and you'd think the same would be true of the government, because a huge amount of this is paid, especially the involuntary stuff is all paid by the government, and but no, I'm not sure how much people have really tried to get to them. They just seem to be happy to pay and get the rates, the insurance rates up to pay for it. But it's kind of a puzzle, really. I mean, there's this program in North Carolina, the Promise Resource Network, and this fabulous executive director, Shireen Carrico, has put together this whole program like what we're talking about with peer respites and other warm lines and things, and they've been so successful that they get a bunch of money from their local city government to do it. But it just hasn't caught on, and I think it's because psychiatrists are granted the status of being authoritative on this. They're they're the experts. So, and they abuse that position in terms of the truth on all this stuff.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've come across this. I don't know if you ever get, I don't know if you're on Twitter or, with your publications and things like that. Have you ever been attacked by patient groups or, groups representing people with bipolar or schizophrenia saying that you're dangerous for, talking about these types of things and that you ought to just leave these groups alone? They've been stigmatized enough, and the last thing they need you to do is to sow any more doubt about whether they need to be on the meds. I mean, has that been something you've experienced?
Some, not a lot, yeah. I wouldn't say.
Where do you think that comes from? Because I do think that I ask because it happens to me sometimes. That we put out there these messages that there are alternatives to medications. I would just love to hear your thoughts on what you think happens, why patients become so upset when these things get brought up.
Well, I think, some people, find the diagnosis very comforting, and believe that the drugs help them. And I'm not going to say that they don't help them, that they think that they help them. And I think they're true believers in that, and they think that I'm being, irresponsible. I think that, that group of people that's sincere, and then you have the NAMI, and they claim that we're irresponsible about this stuff. So, it happens. I think, like I said, the most important thing is trying to change the public understanding of what's going on.
I'll make a segue now because I want to leave some time for us to talk about the Zyprexa papers. Give us an overview of this thrilling book. I've read it. I loved it. Tell the audience a little bit about what you go over in the book.
So in late November of 2006, I get this call out of the blue from this expert witness in this massive litigation over Zyprexa causing diabetes and other metabolic problems that Eli Lilly, the manufacturer, had hidden from the doctors and everybody else. They had evidence of this, and they just suppress it. One of the documents actually says, one of their researchers says, we have to come clean on this, and of course they didn't. So anyway, he wanted me to subpoena him. He had access to what's called discovery in the litigation, which is where the other side has to put in all the information, documentation, and it was subject to a secrecy order. And the secrecy order said if he was subpoenaed in another case, he had to give Lilly notice and a reasonable opportunity to object before he could turn him over. And so he wanted me to subpoena him. And he'd already actually been working with a reporter at the New York Times. And I was interested in that. He had found actually an expert witness report that I posted on the internet about Zyprexa, and that's why he called me. And I figured that he would, give notice, and Lilly would object, and then I would be arguing in front of the Lassie court why my client, Bill Bigley, needed these documents, which, by the way, I didn't have a client at the time, and you can't just subpoena something, you have to have a case. So that was a whole other story about trying to, getting him as a client. Anyway, so I subpoenaed them. They didn't object in time, got him out. The New York Times had a series of front page stories. Lilly was irritated, to say the least. They threatened me with criminal contempt and to try and get me disbarred. And I got, ended up in front of this legendary judge, Jack Weinstein, in Brooklyn, in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York. And it was really quite dramatic, I think. Like, for example, Vera Sharav, she had called me and asked me that she'd heard about it and wanted me to send her 2 copies. And she came in and they, and they asked her, why did you want 2 copies? And she would say, well, I want to give one to the Attorney General because they're killing babies. And the answer to every question was they're killing babies. And then like the lawyer, said, well, do you have them with you? And she said, yes. Well, you were ordered to return them. And she said, no, I wasn't. I had been ordered to try and get them back. And she said, Gottstein just was, ordered to try and get him back. Did he ask you? Yes. Why didn't you turn them in? Because they're killing babies, with this drug. And so, that was a dramatic situation, and how they got out on the internet. And the judge ended up deciding that I had conspired to steal these documents. And I thought that was pretty unfair, frankly, because I feel like I followed the secrecy order to the letter. And anyway, and I'm still permanently enjoined from further dissemination of the Zyprexa papers. And so that's, a big chunk of the book. And the other half is my representation of Bill Bigley, whose life was just ruined by psychiatry. And he really resonated with me because he was just a couple months older than I am or was. And he got hauled into the system a couple of years before me. But he didn't escape. And he was cooperative at first, and then once he started saying, oh, these drugs aren't for me, they started, locking him up and drugging him. And by the time he died, he had been hospitalized 100 times. And but he was quite a guy, really.
Well, it's a fantastic book. I really enjoyed it. And if you're wanting to learn more about this legendary court case and the $3 billion settlement and Jim's role in it, I'd recommend you go out there and grab a copy off Amazon. I'm pretty sure that's where I got it. Thank you so much for coming to our channel. Watching these videos, talking about the content, telling your doctor about these things, this is making a huge impact on the way psychiatry is being practiced. And so thank you for being a part of that.